Hello, everybody. This is Gayl Bowser. I'm your presenter for today for the AbleNet University webinar on overview of coaching skills to support AT use. This is the third in a series of 3 webinars about providing support to people in order to help with AT implementation and other AT services. In the first webinar, we talked about choosing the right support for the situation that you're in. So we talked about the differences, we talked about the steps for providing support no matter what your model is. Then in the second webinar, we talked about the kinds of supports that we might provide, and we talked about consultation, collaboration, and coaching, and the specific uses and benefits of each model. Today we're going to focus entirely on some very basic coaching skills and just think about the way we approach any situation where we're providing support to someone else. You're more likely thinking about something that has to do with assistive technology as you listen to the content for this webinar, but a lot of these skills could be applied to any situation where you want to help someone make a change or do something new and different. Much of the material from today's presentation comes from this book, which I highly recommend. It's called Coaching Conversations, and it's by Linda Gross-Quiliotes and Marcita Fleming-Riley. It was published in 2010 by Corwin Press, and I recommend it particularly because it's a good read, and it's a fairly short book, 125 pages, I think. It also takes a little bit different approach than many of the other coaching manuals that you'll find, whether you're thinking about life coaching or financial coaching or educational coaching. This is a book about educational coaching, but what the subtitle in this book is particularly significant because it talks about transforming your school one conversation at a time. So rather than talking about formal coaching relationships and perhaps even being assigned as a coach to as your job position, this book talks about using coaching strategies in whatever interaction you feel that it's appropriate, and give some ideas and many, many good examples about how to do that. I want to go back to the previous slide for a minute because there's something I forgot to mention. As we talked about coaching in the last session, we emphasized that the purpose of coaching is to help people who want to make a change or do something new or different to think about the ways that they are currently doing things and to solve their own problems. So I use this graphic to exemplify particularly technology coaching because in this graphic the 2 characters are thinking about technology, but the coach is also thinking about how to help the other person solve their own problems. The coaching model really focuses on finding solutions to your own problems and assumes that the coachee, the person that you're providing support to, is able to do that but just may need more information or to think a little bit differently about what it is they're doing. In the Coaching Conversations book and in our session today, we're going to talk about 3 different kinds of coaching skills. The first is active listening, and we'll talk a little bit specifically about listening as we go through the webinar. The second is giving good reflective feedback to the person that you're providing support to. And the third is we called dialogue to empower, but it's really about having conversations and asking questions in a way that helps the other person to think about what they're currently doing and what changes make sense for them. So given those three strategies, coaching strategies, and there are others, but these are the ones we're going to focus on today, I'd like you to do a quick poll here. And the question is, as you think about developing coaching skills, or as you think about learning to use a coaching model in your practice, what do you think is the most important focus for you? So I'd like you to pick one of these bullet points in the poll. Go ahead and respond to it. And we're seeing the results come in quickly. I think you probably are too. We have almost an equal balance between all three of these ideas and these skill areas. People a little bit less on giving good reflective feedback, but almost an exact balance between active listening and dialogue to empower. Now, the reason I asked that question and the reason I wanted you to do the poll was to demonstrate that for each of us, there are probably one or the other of these skill areas that we feel is the most important. They're all equally important, and the poll clearly demonstrated that. But some of us will focus in different areas today as we think about coaching skills, and we will also probably focus in different areas as individuals as we practice some of the coaching skills we're going to talk about. So the first skill area that we're going to talk about today is active listening, and I want to just give you a little bit of background about listening itself. As I developed this material, and I want to say here that Penny Reed also worked with me on developing this material, and it's been a real pleasure to coach each other through learning about the different strategies for providing support to people in the area of AT. But one of the things we did as we developed this material was to do a lot of research. So this slide comes from a compilation of a number of different research studies, but one of the things that we really understood as we did start to work on active listening and learning more about listening was that hearing is very different from listening. Hearing is an autonomic response. It's unconscious. If you aren't selective in what you are hearing, if you don't focus selectively on what you're hearing, you probably won't understand much of what is going on. But listening is a very different, intentional, purposeful, focused activity. So as we think about listening, it's important to remember to be doing some analysis of what you're hearing, as well as listening as a physical response. The International Listening Association, and I loved that there is an International Listening Association. I wasn't aware of that before we developed this material. Gives you some statistics like these. Over 45% of a student's day is spent listening in schools, and students are usually expected to acquire almost 85% of what they learn from listening. But only 2% of the population, either in elementary school or those of us who are working as professionals these days, really ever got training in formal training in listening. When I do this workshop with groups who I can see, I often ask people to raise their hands, and if they did get instruction in listening, And there are two groups that often do raise their hands. The first one, of course, is people who work professionally as counselors or coaches or in some kind of mental health counseling kind of situation. And the other group is often speech therapists. So we don't have the ability right now to raise our hands and say whether or not you got formal training in listening, but I think it's important to think about the fact that there are a lot of listening skills that can be learned as we think about providing support. One of my favorite quotes as we did this research was from this is like a 10-year-old student, a grade school student, who says, when she was asked why she didn't want to participate in class discussion, she says, I think I'll learn more from listening. Anything I would say, I already know. So I think that's a really good summary of why listening can be so important in a coaching model. In the Coaching Conversations book, these are the four main areas that the authors talk about. They speak about attention to verbal and nonverbal communication, and one of the things that we know from research is that about 75% of meaning in a conversational situation is acquired from nonverbal cues and not as much from the words that we say. So listening with a real analytic view of what's going on is a particularly important coaching strategy. We also want to avoid unproductive patterns of listening, and one of the ones that I think about a lot is what is often called autobiographical listening. That's the situation where you're listening in order to find a place where you can jump in and talk about what you know or what your experience has been. So autobiographical listening in a coaching model isn't really so productive because your focus is to listen to find out what the other person knows, what the other person's thinking about, and the kinds of things that might be helpful to them in changing their own practice. One of the most difficult listening skills for me is listening without obligation to act. I always want to just jump in and get something done. I tend to, particularly in an assistive technology conversation, I've tried to learn to back off and let the conversation go longer, even when I think I know the exact solution that's the right answer to the question that the group is discussing. Because often the group, if you can wait and value the conversation, will find their own skills, their own solutions and their own actions to take without the direct suggestions from you. The reason that's important is that when people find their own solutions, they're much more likely to implement them. When they have made personal meaning out of the situation and the challenge, they're much more likely to be able to implement and put into practice the things that they talk about. One illustration of this, particularly for those of you who work with students who use augmentative communication, is that if you value silence, if you wait for students to respond when they're using augmentative communication, one of the things we know from lots of research is that they will give you better information and you will get higher order thinking. So if you have a student who's using perhaps the sounding board app or some other communication system, we have all learned to wait for them to respond so that they can think about which buttons to push, which areas on the screen to touch, and give them a chance to process what they're thinking about. The same thing is true for the people that you're providing support to. If you wait, if you give them a little bit of a chance to think it out and decide without interruption what their actions are, they will also have better information processing and higher order thinking. Now, I have to tell you, I snuck in something because I am a proud grandma. This is a picture of my granddaughter. And I put it in because it also illustrates the point of valuing silence. My son sent me this picture when Nami was about 2 months old, and this is a picture of her smiling in her sleep. And what my son said in the email was, she smiles herself to sleep. She's practicing smiling. So I want to encourage you to let other people practice their smiles, practice their good thoughts, and value the silence in a conversation. One of the handouts that I understand you're having trouble getting to is a listening skills assessment. There we go. And since you are not able to download it right now, or a lot of people are having trouble, what I want to do is share it with you on my desktop. So give me just a second while I do that. And wow, that was exciting. This is a listening skills assessment that is one of your handouts. It's from Peak Focus, which is actually a business group where they're teaching business people to evaluate their own listening skills because it's such an important thing. I want to take just a minute to ask you to read these lists of items that are on the left side here, and choose one or two that you think perhaps you might want to work on as you practice your coaching and listening skills. So I am going to take just a minute and be a little silent. If I had some background music to play, I'd do it. Okay, I'm going to go back to the webinar screen, and what I'd like to do is ask you, instead of talking with a partner, what I'd like to ask you to do is to type into the chat box if you identified a skill that you think maybe you want to work on as you practice your listening skills. As you do that, I'll tell you a story. I just came from a week-long meeting with the leadership team for the Quality Indicators for Assistive Technology project, the QUIET project. And as I left that meeting, I realized there was so much going on that I, too, was easily distracted. I would be talking to one person about one kind of work activity, and someone else would bring up another work activity. I see a lot of people who are sort of agreeing with me. It's hard not to be distracted particularly when you're in some of the classroom environments that we tend to work in. It's hard not to be distracted. The other one that I've been working on actively these days is interrupting. I tend to jump in when I think I know the answer rather than doing what I'm hoping you will do and letting people take time to develop their own solutions. So I see lots and lots of people talking about the skills that they've identified. Michelle says, I need to work on being an active listener more, so it's the fact that I want to solve the students' problems right away, but I don't have to try and let the students' problems solve the students problem solve for themselves. So Michelle's talking about a situation where she's actually coaching the students to use their own technology. Lots and lots of cool responses from people. Because this is a short session, I'm going to go on to the next coaching skill area, which is reflective feedback. There's a lot to learn about giving good feedback to people in ways that are meaningful and that help them think about solving their own problems or identifying their own implementation strategies. So let's talk a little bit about reflection and giving people reflective feedback. Again, as we did the research for this presentation, Penny and I discovered some interesting things about reflection and reflective feedback. One is that shared reflection amplifies and creates new information. So when you and I both talk about our experience of the situation and what happened, or our ideas about solutions to solve problems, and when we share that reflection together, we're more likely to build new meaning with each new perception or conversation. Reflection activates the brain. It activates the brain in several different areas, so it's more likely to come up with new ideas because it helps to make actually literally new brain connections. And what we know from research is that constructive feedback that's timely and specific builds on strengths and increases performance. Now, when we talk about feedback, it's important to remember that we're talking about analyzing usually a situation that has already happened rather than coming up with new ideas to try new things. One of the things that I really have recognized in my practice in assistive technology is that it's very easy with assistive technology to try one tool, perhaps a Big Mac switch or some kind of sequential message device, and to say, oh, that didn't work, let's try a different tool. If we're thinking about giving reflective feedback, what we're suggesting that we do is look at what has been already happening and analyzing it for almost task analyzing it to find out where things went wrong and where the problems arose, and then making a decision about whether or not it's the proper tool. I teach a class on assistive technology implementation. It's an online class through Portland State University, and one of the activities is that we ask people to think about a student who is already using an assistive technology tool and then apply some very specific strategies to that situation. In that class, it always fascinates me how many people want to just jump from the tool that was selected by the IEP team and written into the IEP to another tool when things aren't working well. And what I want to suggest to you is that some reflection about the situation, giving the person you're providing support to the chance to reflect with you about what's going on in the situation, often reveals some very little detail-y kinds of things that can be changed and that will make the tool that you already chose much more effective and much more easy to implement. So that's it's just a suggestion. When things start to go wrong, analyze the situation, do it with the person you're providing the support to, and see if you can't identify some things in the environment or some things that need to be taught or some other kinds of factors that are interfering with the use of the tool. Because we're pretty good these days at doing good AT assessment, at choosing the right tools. When you do that kind of reflection, here are suggestions for how to do it in a more coaching model. So in your initiation of a reflective conversation about what's been happening, what's already happened, and where would we like to go from here, it's important to have a single focus. One of the things that is a common error in coaching conversations is to try and address too many things at the same time, to talk about the way the switch was placed and what was on the message and who set it up all at the same time. So as you build a reflective conversation, having a single focus, which is often how can we improve this situation or what is going wrong here, is a very valuable skill. Always in your reflective feedback strategies, it's important to invite the other person to reflect. Giving feedback is, in a coaching model, is your opportunity to really talk, to really have opinions and state them, but always keeping in mind that in a coaching model, what we're trying to do is to get the person we're providing support to think in new and different ways, or to think more deeply about the situation than they've thought before. Many of you may have had the experience of trying something new with a student or in a classroom environment or at home, and the person you're working with says after, one 20-minute trial, well, that's not going to work. So in that kind of a situation, one of the things you might do is begin to ask questions about why that person thinks it's not going to work, and also to use some additional strategies to give good feedback. So those strategies can be clarification, affirming your own values, or a focus on possible actions. One of the mistakes that I know that I tend to make in my coaching practice and in the work I do to provide support to other people is that I tend to focus exclusively on possible actions. I've got a million good ideas, and I know the rest of you do too, have a whole lot of good ideas, and I just want to share them with everybody. I once heard a presentation from an early intervention provider who was talking about working with families, and he was talking about the fact that in order to really develop relationships with families in ways that allow them to make changes in their homes or in their environments, or to start to implement the recommendations of an early intervention team, it takes about 5 home visits. So the first 3 or 4 visits in an early intervention environment are often about developing relationships. If you're working with a new support situation, a new person that you don't know very well, I think that's an important thing to remember, and I suspect it applies to way more than just early intervention families. For sure we know that until we begin to develop relationships with the people we're providing support to, they will not be able to listen as well to us or to work as well with us, because they're still trying to figure out what's going on here and what the situation is. If you participated in our first webinar in this series, we talked about how important it is at the beginning of any kind of support relationship to talk about the ways you're going to work together and the goal of the support that you're providing and things like that. So until you develop that direct relationship, a focus on possible actions can even be a little overwhelming to the people that we provide support to. Using the other 2 strategies on this list, clarification of what's going on and affirming your own values, can be much more effective practices, particularly in a new relationship where you haven't done a lot of reflection on the situation before together. So clarification as a coaching strategy is a lot about asking questions, like, what do you think was going on there when he absolutely refused to use the iPad? What do you think was going on there? What do you think is going on with the educational assistant who never remembers to pull it out on the scheduled time when the iPad's going to be used? Those kinds of clarification questions can really help the person that you're providing support to be more reflective and figure out in a more analytical way what's going on, as opposed to, well, it just doesn't work. As a coach, it's also important to be upfront about your own values and what you see as important in the situation, but to do it with I statements rather than instructions. So it's a wonderful thing to say, boy, I really, really loved it when he did this, or when the instructional assistant did this, or when you did this in the situation we're analyzing. I want to do another quick poll here just to get you involved, and so here it is. Oh, wait. I skipped that. That's the wrong poll in the wrong situation. I apologize. We'll use that one later. So let's go on to activities to encourage reflection. We can seek alternatives. We can view the situation from various perspectives, asking questions like, well, what do you think the dad was thinking about that when in this situation? What do you think the teacher was thinking about in the same situation? One of the things that works really well for me is to look for the framework or the paradigm that's affecting the situation. What is it that everybody in this classroom believes about whether or not this student's going to be a successful communicator? What is it that everybody in this classroom believes about the use of an iPad or as a communication device, or an iPad as a tool for writing? Often when you begin to reflect on particular situations and analyze them, you find that there is some kind of underlying framework or paradigm that is affecting the integration and implementation of assistive technology. Sometimes it's just the classroom schedule and how tightly tied we are to it. Sometimes it's something that's outside of our control, but recognizing what the underlying frameworks and paradigms are can be very helpful. Another strategy that's also very helpful is to compare and contrast the performance in one environment and another environment, or compare performance of the student with one instructional assistant and with a teacher, or with one instructional assistant and another instructional assistant. What we're doing really here is trying to analyze the situation, find out what might be interfering, and put our analysis into different contexts to see if we can come up with new solutions and new ideas. And so that's the reflective feedback part of coaching skills. So we've talked about active listening, and we've talked about reflective feedback. Let's go on to my favorite part, which is the dialogue to empower part of our webinar today. In the Coaching Conversations book, the authors suggest these 5 ways to approach dialogues that help empower and help the other person to think differently. The first is making sure that you know your intention, choosing your words carefully and framing your criteria for the situation, assuming from the beginning that the person that you're providing support to is competent and willing to work with you and willing to improve their own practice, avoiding advice, and asking powerful questions. So these are the 5 bullet points. Let's talk about each one of them in a little bit of detail. And I want to say to you, again, this is a shortened version of a much longer presentation. So, and I thought about how to give you really valuable information about coaching during this hour without being overwhelming or just totally totally confusing. So I've chosen a couple places to focus in each area, and that I think will be particularly evident in this section of the webinar. So the first skill area is create an intention. The authors suggest that you want to avoid the action of ready, fire, aim. I often find myself doing that, particularly in a meeting situation where we're trying to brainstorm with a large group of people. As a consultant and as a support person who is perceived as having a certain level of expertise, one of the things that I've discovered is that if I make a suggestion, it often stops conversation with the other people in the room. So I'm very careful to not to fire before I aim my actions and my words at a particular intention or target. So in my coaching practice, my goal is to help the people in the environment figure out their own solutions. I've identified my mission with them and also my personal goal for what I hope I can help them do in that particular situation. I'd like to tell you a story about that. About a week and a half ago, I was volunteering in a group home where there are 3 adolescent boys with autism, and all 3 of them have communication issues and also tend to be fairly explosive when they're frustrated. So we were talking about their communication strategies, and we were talking about whether or not they had the ability to tell people when they were frustrated. I immediately jumped in quickly with some ideas about using picture exchange systems and visual calendars and visual schedules, things that were not in place in the group home, even though they were in place at school. But I started to problem solve. And what I saw in the first part of our day together was that people were just asking me questions. How would we do it? Just lots and lots of questions, and I was giving lots and lots of answers. When I realized what was happening and that they weren't really thinking on their own about how they might solve problems, I switched from giving answers to asking questions back. So when they would say to me, well, how would we use these pictures when he has to get on the bus and go to school? And I started to respond rather than with suggestions with questions back. So I would say, well, what do you think the best way would be? And got responses from the group home staff and from the director of the group home. By the end of my time with them, I spent about 2 hours with them that day talking about all 3 clients in the group home. And by the end of my time with them, they had independently decided on some routines that they wanted to address first using the picture system, and also assigned responsibility to people in the group home. So somebody was going to make a set of pictures that were large enough for one of the clients to see because he has a visual impairment. Somebody was going to make sure they all got laminated once they were made. Somebody was going to make a list of pictures. But what happened was an amazing switch from me being an expert, giving a lot of answers, to me being a person who helped them think about their own goals in a new way. And I think if I had gone on the way I had been of giving answers to everybody, by the end of the day, I would have had a lot of things to do, like choose the vocabulary, make the pictures, and get them laminated. So as I kept in mind my intention of empowering the group home staff to do this communication strategy and to help, actually the goal is to reduce the number of violent outbursts in the group home. As I focused on that goal of helping them figure out how to do it rather than giving answers, I saw a really almost magical change in the attitudes and the situations. So keeping in mind that intention to be a coach and not an expert is a really valuable thing to do. You also have to make sure you have a criteria. So in that group home example, we knew that we wanted all three boys to have fewer behavior outbursts, in particular fewer ones that resulted in damage to people or the home itself. Here's another example. We often do this. We frame our criteria for our students. These are IEP goals, basically. To be successful, Yuko will increase the number of times she initiates communication, decrease the number of disruptive vocalizations, and communicate more often with peers. We're good at setting this kind of criteria, but I want to encourage you as you think about using a coaching model, or actually almost any kind of a model, to frame your criteria for the person that you're providing support to. And when you do this, it's most important to do it with the coachee or the person you're providing the support to. So here's an example of what an educator decided that she needed to be able to do in order to help Yuko accomplish the goals that we had set for Yuko. So she decided that she wanted to be able to operate the AT independently herself, to include the technology used just in language arts instruction at the point we were developing these goals, and then to develop procedures for students. Oh, that's a different example. I apologize. Develop procedures for students who use text-to-speech for reading. So this isn't Yuko's teacher, it's another teacher, but she set these goals for herself, and then we were able to talk about what will it take to reach each of these goals. I want to encourage you right now to think of an AT situation, or a situation where you're providing AT support. It could be to a parent, it could be to another teacher, or it could be to anybody. And think about, at this point I want to encourage you to think about a challenging situation, and then what is your goal for this situation? I see a question from Joanne who says, do you find it helpful to have the student use different types of AT to see how they like the system? And yes, Joanne, of course, as we're doing assessment, as we're trying to figure out the assessment situation, we want to try all kinds of solutions to help us see how the student likes the AT, but also to help us understand what their actual skill level is. I had the experience on these AbleNet webinars of finding that many of you are working with students with significant cognitive and often multiple disabilities. And for me, the only way to find out what those students know and can learn and what technology they need to use is to try a variety of things. But at some point we have to stop and make a decision. We have to say, okay, for now we're going to stick with this tool or this set of tools or this set of tools and strategies, and we're going to try implementation. As I said before, if it's easy to think that if you try one tool and the student doesn't seem to like it or the student doesn't seem to want to use it, to think that it's the wrong tool. But sometimes an analysis of the situation can really show that it's not the tool itself that's the problem, but the things in the environment and the things that need to be done to support tool use. Michelle says, I have nonverbal students with physical disability. My goal is to have as many communication devices and visuals to communicate with my students and have my assistants and teachers communicate to these students as well. So Michelle's goal or intention for the support interaction is to have a variety of tools and devices used in meaningful ways for communication in her school environment. Thank you for typing that in, Michelle, and if you don't mind, I want to use it as an example as we think about helping people think about what they're doing. So in your situation, one of the questions you might ask some of your assistant teachers is, okay, we're going to do this activity. It might be a morning circle. It might be a reading lesson. It might be some kind of self-help activity or just a participation activity. So in a coaching model, rather than saying to your assistant teachers, I think you should go get that device and use it with the student, you might, if you haven't already decided, you might say, what do you think the best tool for communication in this activity would be? So that would be more of a coaching model that was aimed at your particular goal and your particular situation. One of the reasons we do this is that it empowers people to take more responsibility for themselves. And as a classroom teacher, I always wanted my teaching assistants and my students to have as much independence and autonomy as possible in order to make the classroom run more smoothly. And quite honestly, that's the goal for our students, is to have them be autonomous and independent communicators in your situation. Sherry says, my goal is to support physical access to the iPad. The student is adamant that he wants to use his finger. He would only use it with me, but not with other staff. So in this case, Sherry, what you're offering is, I'm actually going to go back to the previous slide. What you're describing is a situation where you really have to coach the student. And we've all run into situations like this where I see, stylus versus finger. Thank you. We've all run into situations like this where a student really wants to be as much like the other kids as possible and then puts themselves in a situation where they may not be as successful because being like other kids is more important. I'm wondering at this point if other people have ideas for Sherry about how they might deal with this kind of a situation with a student in a coaching model. Would you provide some thoughtful questions to the student? Would you provide thoughtful questions to the classroom staff? How would you identify possible actions in this situation. So if anybody has suggestions for Sherry about this student who only wants to use his finger, not a stylus, on the iPad, it'd be great if you could type them in. While we're waiting for that, I am going to go on to the next slide. And one of the important things about having an intention is that as you provide support, particularly to adults, it's important to have a balance between the ways of how your intention matches what you say. So a careful balance gives clarity about how much of a role you will play in the coaching situation. So you don't want to be an expert, as I was when I described the group home situation at first, and I was just telling them what to do. I also was careful in that situation not to imply that I was going to do a lot of things that I actually didn't have the ability to do. So ways to do that. Ask questions. Don't give so many answers. Let the people figure out their own solutions. Make sure your questions are focused on the actual goal and not on side situations or barriers that are keeping you from accomplishing your goal. And also making sure that you acknowledge the things that you come into the situation with. So acknowledge your presuppositions. We've had several suggestions in the chat box about how Sherry might accomplish her goal. And Mary says use of peers may help. So in a coaching model, what we would say to Laura is, Laura, do you think that the use of peers in this situation might be helpful? Are there other kids who might be helpful in helping the student use a stylus? Lynette, I'm sorry, I don't know. Yeah, someone else says reward the students when they use the stylus. And Joanne says, I'd ask the students some questions. Why do you not like the stylus? Find their favorite sport and create a sleeve to personalize the pointer, make the pointer more attractive. Carol says, it's functional to include a goal on the IEP to address the issues that you're coaching the student on. Oh, so this is a more general coaching question. Or are goals helpful and time allowed on service minutes to address coaching needs? You know, for the most part, a coaching model is used with other adults. So unless, in our IEPs here in Oregon, and I think in all IEPs across the country, there's a place where you list supports for staff or services needed. So you could identify specifically that you're going to use a coaching strategy in an IEP to provide supports for staff, but you might also just do what you've always done and call it, what you've always called it, AT specialist services or something like that. Because one of the things we know also about coaching is we don't always use a coaching model. Sometimes there's other strategies that are equally as valuable or more valuable in a particular situation. So I don't know that I'd put a coaching on an IEP unless I had been assigned to, and my job title was coach. We've talked in this Dialogue to Empower section a lot about asking questions. Questions are incredibly powerful at helping people think and solve their own solutions. So I want to spend our last little bit of time together talking about questions and giving you a little bit of homework. I know we won't meet again in this series, but I'm going to give you a little homework anyway because I think it's a valuable activity. Let's talk about the questions themselves. Coaches are skilled at constructing and composing questions with the intention of engaging and transforming thought. So when we talked about identifying your intention for the interaction, for me, in a coaching situation, that's my goal, to help people think in new ways. Some of the research about, this isn't the research slide, we ask questions because the person we're talking with, the one we're providing support to, knows more about the situation than we do. Also, asking questions gets people involved and creates buy-in. Again, the group home story where everyone was sitting at the table with me asking me lots of questions which I was answering, and when I turned it around and began to ask questions back to them about the situation, what does this person like to do? How could you, what kind of reward system could you use? Things like that. What are your ideas and why? It gets people involved and it becomes their thing, so they're more likely to implement. Asking questions also empowers them. They all felt like they had the ability to implement this program, and that was a good thing because I only go down there about once a month. It develops leadership capacity. It was clear to me in that group home setting that there was one person on the staff who was going to make sure this happened because she really cared about one of the guys, and he was somebody she loved to spend time with, and she wanted to know what he had to say. So the other thing, though, is that asking questions communicates and builds trust. It makes you a team member rather than an expert from the outside. Lois says it's important to be mindful that the questions are open-ended to ensure dialogue rather than yes-no questions. Absolutely, Lois, and thank you for reminding us of this. Joanne has a phrase that she says she frequently uses. I like to use here's an idea, and ask, what are your thoughts? Do you like the idea, and why? So, again, another open-ended question, but directed in a particular way to help think about the situation. Good coaching questions assume positive intent, focus on positive connections. As Lois said, they're open-ended, and they invite many answers. When you're asking a coaching question and there's really only one or two answers, people don't have the opportunity to think as much. Coaching questions also focus on solutions, not problems, and encourage deeper levels of thinking. Terry says, when we consult, we need to model how we get to the solutions as much as providing solutions, sometimes thinking out loud. And I think that's exactly the kind of thing that we're talking about in talking about questioning as a coaching strategy. There are also some common coaching errors that are sort of the opposite of the good things that people have been suggesting in the chat box. Asking closed questions. Somebody earlier mentioned in the chat, yes or no questions. Solution-focused questions. So a solution-focused question. Have you ever tried a tablet with a communication app with this person? Rambling questions that just go on forever and you're not really sure what the question is. And I love the last two bullets, interrupting and neglecting to interrupt. So interrupting is a rude thing to do, and it stops people from thinking, but on the other hand, in a group situation, if somebody's going on too long and monopolizing the conversation, it's also helpful to interrupt in order to refocus the thinking. Jim Knight is the head of the I believe it's the Kansas Institute for Educational Coaching, something like that. He's at the University of Kansas, and if you Google Jim Knight and coaching, you will find all kinds of wonderful free information about educational coaching that can be very helpful to you. It is about general education coaching, not so much assistive technology coaching, but he suggests that you have a generic question recipe. So here's some suggestions for his kinds of questions. How do you see this working? What are some other ways of looking at this? Things like that. I said I was going to give you homework, so here's your homework. I want to suggest to you that you create a personal AT coaching question recipe, a list of things that you could use in your difficult situation that you thought of, and to try them out in one situation where maybe you're not as happy with your own performance as you might be, and you'd like to make a few changes. So your homework, and this is one of your handouts along with some suggestions for a coaching recipe or list, is to create that and try it in a particular situation. I see we're about out of time, so I wanted to say to you, thank you for all of you who participated in all three of these webinars. Thank you for those of you who weren't able to do the whole series but joined us for part of it. My goal in all of these three webinars was to get you to think not the way I think, but to think more than you thought before. I hope the webinar has been helpful and useful for you. I am happy to take questions and concerns for as long as we're able to stay online today. And but also I want to encourage you, if you begin to use coaching strategies or any of the strategies we've talked about in this series, I want to encourage you to contact me offline. My email address is on the first slide in the PowerPoint handout that you received. And I want to encourage you to continue this dialogue offline. The PowerPoint presentation is available as I believe as a PDF, and Gloria's been giving you that link to that. Also, I wanted to mention one more thing. You'll get a short survey after you sign off of the ReadyTalk site, and I'd love to hear how you are doing and how we did with this webinar. So thank you. I'm happy to have been with you today, and I hope you got some valuable information.